Herluin, remembered by history as Herluin de Conteville, Viscount of Normandy and stepfather to William the Conqueror. He was a man of modest lands and quiet ambition, a Norman lord who asked for little and was given something extraordinary. Born into the lower reaches of the nobility, he held a small portion of land south of the Seine, governed his people, and lived a life that history had no particular reason to remember. And then, one day, a duke placed a woman in his care, a woman who had already changed the world without knowing it, because the child she carried would one day reshape England forever. Herluin accepted what was offered. He married her. He gave her a home. He raised her children alongside his own. And when the great storm of 1066 finally broke over the English coast, it was the sons born in that modest Norman household who stood at its very centre. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you've just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you're returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we'll share the calm, complete story of Herluin de Conteville, a Norman lord of quiet courage whose marriage to the mother of William the Conqueror wove him into one of history's most remarkable dynasties, told slowly and with care to help guide you into sleep. We'll softly explore his world from beginning to end, from the rolling fields of 11th century Normandy through the perilous years of a young duke's endangered childhood to the thunderous events of 1066, and finally to the abbey he built beside a healing spring, where he and those he loved were laid to rest. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which figure in tonight's story surprised you most help keep these tales coming. To understand Herluin de Conteville, we must first understand the world into which he was born. A world shaped by sea-crossing ancestors, by old oaths and new ambitions, and by a duchy that had spent barely a century becoming something more than a settlement of raiders on the northern coast of France. It was the early years of the 11th century. The land that men called Normandy, the land of the Northmen, the Normans, had been carved out of the kingdom of the Franks some 90 years before, when a great Viking chieftain by the name of Rollo had accepted a grant of land from the Frankish king Charles the Simple in exchange for his baptism into the Christian faith and his pledge of feudal loyalty. Rollo had been a raider of considerable ferocity, a man who had terrorized the coastlines of France and England alike. But he had been, in the end, a practical man, and he had recognized that it was better to govern a rich land in peace than to plunder it in war. He took the land, he took the faith, he took the name Robert at his baptism, and he set about building something. What Rollo built, his descendants extended and refined over the generations that followed. His son William Longsword continued the work. His grandson Richard I, Richard the Fearless, they called him, pushed the boundaries of Norman influence outward and deepened the duchy's roots. By the time the calendar turned toward the year 1000, Normandy was no longer simply a settlement of converted Vikings. It was a proper duchy, a feudal state with its own duke, its own nobility, its own courts, its own laws, and its own ambitions. The Norman language, a blend of Old Norse and the Old French of the surrounding Franks, had taken shape. The Norman church, rebuilt and reformed under the watchful eye of successive archbishops at Rouen, had become a source of considerable pride. Norman monasteries were among the finest in northern France. Norman castles, the motte and bailey fortresses of earth and timber that would later give way to stone towers, were multiplying across the landscape. It was into this world that Herluin was born, sometime around the year 1001. We say around because the historical record offers us no precise date. There is, in truth, no contemporary document that even records the name of his parents. Later genealogical sources, compiled centuries after his death, would assign him a father named Jean de Conteville and a mother named Harlette de Moulin, but these names appear in sources of questionable reliability, and no medieval chronicle of the 11th or early 12th century mentions them. Herluin de Conteville emerges from the historical record essentially without origins, a man who simply appears, holding a small piece of land, living a modest lord's life south of the River Seine, in the province of Normandy. His lordship was centred on the village and lands of Conteville, a place that still exists today, a quiet commune in the Eure department of Upper Normandy, sitting not far from where the Seine bends toward the sea at Honfleur. It was not grand territory. Herluin himself was later described in the sources as a lord of moderate income and some land on the south side of the River Seine. Those words, moderate income, are important. They tell us something essential about who Herluin was in the hierarchy of Norman society. He was not a great count. He was not a powerful baron whose name appears in the chronicles as a maker of wars and a disposer of kingdoms. He was a minor lord, a man of some local standing, holding his lands by the feudal customs of the duchy, governing his tenants, attending the courts of his superiors, and living the ordinary life of a lesser Norman nobleman in the early years of the 11th century. And yet ordinary is not quite the right word for what Herluin's life would become. To understand the Norman world Herluin inhabited, we need to spend a little time with the landscape of feudal obligation and personal loyalty that shaped everything in that society. In 11th century Normandy, a man's place in the world was defined first and foremost by his relationship to the Duke. The Duke of Normandy was not simply a political ruler. He was the apex of a pyramid of personal loyalty, a figure to whom every lord in the duchy owed military service, financial obligation, and personal fidelity. Below the Duke sat the great magnates, the counts and the powerful viscounts, who held large territories and commanded significant military forces. Below them sat men like Herluin, the lesser lords, the minor viscounts, the knights and landholders who owed their tenure to those above them. This was a world of intense personal relationships. A lord knew his duke. He attended his court. He fought in his wars. He witnessed his charters. And in return, the duke knew his lords, their names, their families, their loyalties, their usefulness. The bond between lord and duke was not merely administrative, it was personal. And it was this quality of personal relationship, this closeness between a powerful man and his trusted lesser vassals, that would set the stage for the most remarkable moment in Herluin's life. Because one day, a duke would trust him with something priceless. But that is a story for a little later. First, let us continue to understand the world. Normandy in the early 11th century was a place of growing sophistication and considerable internal tension. The Dukes of Normandy, Richard the Frere, had been followed by his son, Richard II, and Richard II's reign spanned the years from 996 to 1026, were powerful men, but the power of any feudal ruler depended always on the loyalty of those beneath him. Norman nobles were proud, ambitious, and frequently restless. The duchy had grown quickly, and with growth came competition for land, for influence, for the favour of the duke himself. Great families rose and fell, rivalries simmered, alliances shifted. This was the essential political climate of Herluin's youth and early manhood. A duchy in which peace was real but never entirely guaranteed, in which loyalty was prized above almost everything, and in which a man who could be trusted absolutely was worth more than one who merely possessed great estates. We know almost nothing of Herluin's early life, his childhood, his education, his first experiences of the world. No chronicle records his boyhood. No document preserves the name of a tutor or mentor. He presumably grew up in the way that minor Norman lords' sons grew up, learning to ride, to bear arms, to manage land, to understand the obligations of feudal life, to attend the church, to hear the prayers of the great abbeys that dotted the Norman countryside. He presumably learned something of letters, though the depth of any formal education among men of his class varied considerably. He was, by the customs and expectations of his time, a knight and a small landowner, a man shaped by the rhythms of agricultural life and the duties of feudal service. And then, in or around the year 1027, the world of Normandy changed in a way that would eventually reach even Herluin's quiet corner of it. Richard II of Normandy died in 1026 and was succeeded briefly by his eldest son, Richard III. But Richard III died within a year, in 1027, and the duchy passed to his younger brother, a young man of remarkable energy and considerable appetite, who would govern Normandy as Duke Robert I. History would give him two nicknames: Robert the Magnificent, for the grandeur of his personality and his generosity with gifts and hospitality, and Robert the Devil, for the ferocity of his temper and the ruthlessness of his political methods. Both names tell us something true about him. Robert I was a man of extremes, capable of great warmth and great violence in equal measure, a ruler who inspired intense loyalty in those he favoured and fear in those who crossed him. He was also, in the early years of his reign, a young man, and young men, even dukes, sometimes fall in love. It was around this time, in the late 1020s, that Robert encountered a young woman from the town of Falaise. Her name was Herleva, and her story is, in many ways, the story of everything that follows. Herleva of Falaise is one of the most famous women of the Norman world, not because of what she did exactly, but because of who she gave birth to. She is the mother of William the Conqueror, one of the most consequential figures in English and European history. And yet, like so many women of her era, she exists at the edges of the historical record, glimpsed in fragments, remembered in legends, known more through her son than through her own documented life. What we know, or believe we know, about Herleva's origins is itself a matter of some debate among historians. The most widely circulated version of her story, the one that has been told and retold across 9 centuries of popular history, begins with a young woman of humble birth, the daughter of a tanner from the town of Falaise. Falaise was a significant settlement in Normandy, a town built around a great castle that sat high on a limestone plateau, and it was well known at the time for its leatherworking and tanning industries. In this popular tradition, Herleva's father, whose name was Fulbert, was a tanner, a man who worked with animal hides, processing them into leather, an occupation that was essential but not particularly prestigious in medieval society. The specific identification of Fulbert as a tanner comes from a reading of the Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who wrote in the early 12th century and who added important details to an earlier chronicle called the Gesta Normanorum Ducum. Orderic records that during William's later siege of Alençon, the townspeople mocked the besieging duke by calling him a pelterer, a reference to his mother's kinsman, whom Orderic described with the Latin word pollinctores. The problem is that pollinctores, in classical Latin, does not mean tanners. It means people who prepare bodies for burial, embalmers, or those who lay out the dead. The word was later misread or mistranslated, and tanner became the standard English description. Modern historians have looked at this more carefully. The scholar Elizabeth van Houts, in particular, has argued persuasively that Fulbert was more likely an embalmer or undertaker than a tanner in the conventional sense, and that in the practice of the time, the chamberlain of a great lord was often responsible for burial arrangements. This matters because Orderic Vitalis himself also states, in a separate passage, that Fulbert became the Duke's chamberlain, that is, an official member of the ducal household, a position of real responsibility and modest prestige. A man who was merely a common tanner could not easily have risen to such a role. Others have gone further, arguing that indirect evidence, specifically the fact that Herleva's brothers were later named as official witnesses to charters issued by the underage Duke William, and the fact that the Count of Flanders accepted Herleva as a proper guardian for his daughter, suggests that Fulbert's family was of the burgher class rather than the peasant class. A tanner's daughter could not plausibly have occupied those roles. What can we say with reasonable confidence? Herleva was born in Falaise, most likely somewhere in the first decade of the 11th century. Her father was named Fulbert. Her mother was named Doda. She had at least two brothers, Walter and Osborne, whose names appear in Norman charters. Her family was probably not of the nobility, but was not of the very lowest rank either. They occupied that middle ground of the prosperous townspeople, the burgher class, that existed between the knights and the peasants, and she was, by all accounts, a young woman of notable appearance. The legend of how she came to the attention of Duke Robert III has been told many times, and it has the quality of a story that has been polished by centuries of retelling. According to the most popular version, still recounted today by guides at Falaise Castle, Robert was walking along the battlements of his castle one afternoon when he looked down and saw a young woman working in the dyeing trenches below. The traditional method of dyeing cloth or leather involved trampling barefoot on the submerged material, and Herleva, engaged in this work, had raised her skirts above her ankles to keep them from the dye. Robert, looking down from above, was immediately captivated. Whether we take this legend literally or as a romantic embellishment of what was probably a more ordinary encounter, the essential fact is clear enough. Robert, Duke of Normandy, became attached to Herleva of Falaise sometime around the year 1027. She became his mistress, or, in the language of the chroniclers, his concubine. This gave her a kind of semi-official status. She was not his wife. Robert, like most medieval rulers, was careful about the political implications of formal marriage, but she was recognized as his acknowledged companion, and her position in relation to the Duke was understood by those around them. Their relationship produced a child. William was born, most likely at Falaise, in either 1027 or 1028. The exact year is uncertain. The chroniclers disagree, and the evidence allows us to say only that William was born sometime in those years. He grew up knowing his father's name and his father's status. He was, in the language of the day, illegitimate, born outside of formal marriage. His contemporaries would later call him William the Bastard, a name used as a taunt by his enemies and as a plain description by his chroniclers. But his father acknowledged him from the beginning, and that acknowledgement would matter enormously in the years to come. At some point after William's birth, Robert arranged something important. He decided that Herleva should be provided for, given a respectable life, a proper household, the dignity of a legitimate marriage. According to some accounts, Robert always held Herleva in genuine affection, but the distance between a duke and a tanner's daughter, or a burgher's daughter, was too great for formal marriage to be considered a political possibility. And so Robert, being the kind of man who expressed his affection through practical arrangements, did what powerful men did in such circumstances. He found her a husband. The husband he chose was Herluin de Conteville. The decision to marry Herleva to Herluin was not arbitrary. Duke Robert chose his men carefully, and the fact that he entrusted Herleva, the mother of his only son, to Herluin's care tells us something important about the kind of man Herluin was. He was trusted. He was, in Robert's estimation, a safe pair of hands, a man who could be depended upon to treat Herleva with dignity, to provide her with a home, and to raise whatever children she bore him with the appropriate care. Robert was not simply disposing of an inconvenient mistress. He was, in his way, providing for a woman he cared about, in the manner available to him. The marriage took place around the year 1031. Herleva, who was most likely in her mid to late 20s by this point, came to Conteville as Herluin's wife, bringing with her a young son, William, already perhaps 3 or 4 years old, and the complicated legacy of her relationship with the most powerful man in Normandy. We can only imagine what that arrival looked like. Herluin's lands were not grand. Modest fields, a small castle or fortified hall, tenants who owed him service and rent, a household of servants and dependents. But it was a real home, a settled place, and after the uncertainty of life as a duke's acknowledged mistress, it must have offered Herleva something she had perhaps not had before, a kind of permanence. What was the relationship between Herluin and his stepson? The historical record does not give us a direct answer. No chronicle records a conversation between the two. No document preserves the texture of daily life at Conteville. But we can make some reasonable inferences. William spent at least some of his early years in the household at Conteville, or in proximity to his mother and Herluin. The two half-brothers who would later be so important to William's life, Odo and Robert, were born during these years, growing up alongside him or near him. The bonds of half-brotherhood forged in childhood were, in William's case, bonds that endured and strengthened across decades. The love and trust that William later placed in Odo and Robert had to begin somewhere, and the most plausible beginning is in the shared childhood of that Norman household. Herleva and Herluin had their children in fairly quick succession. Odo was born first, somewhere around 1030, or a little earlier. Historians disagree about his exact birth year, and the uncertainty is genuine, with estimates ranging from approximately 1030 to as late as 1036. Robert was born next, probably around 1031 or 1032. Then came daughters. The historical record is less precise about them, but two can be identified with reasonable confidence. Emma, who later married Richard Le Gauze, Viscount of Avranches, and a second daughter, whose name does not survive with certainty in the sources, sometimes called Muriel in later genealogical traditions, who married a Norman lord named Guillaume, Seigneur de la Ferté-Macé. So the household at Conteville in those years of the early 1030s was a busy and growing one. Herleva was at its centre, a woman who had lived a remarkable life before she arrived there, and who now settled into the rhythms of a Norman lord's wife, bearing children, managing the household, watching her eldest son from an earlier time grow toward manhood. Herluin was its head, quiet, steady, described by no chronicle as a man of great ambition or dramatic personality, but clearly a man of sufficient standing to be trusted with something precious. And then, in the year 1035, the world changed. Duke Robert the Fun of Normandy, still a young man in his mid-30s, decided to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was not an unusual decision for a man of his era and piety. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land were the great spiritual journeys of the medieval world, undertaken as acts of devotion and atonement. Robert, who had accumulated a great many sins in his turbulent career, appears to have felt a genuine need for spiritual expiation. Before he left, he did something of enormous importance. He gathered his Norman barons together and required them to swear loyalty to his son William as his heir. William was illegitimate, and in the ordinary course of things, illegitimacy would have barred him from succession. But Robert had no other children, no legitimate son, no other heir, and he was determined that his line would continue. The assembled barons swore the oath. Robert departed. He never came back. Robert I, Duke of Normandy, died at the city of Nicaea in Asia Minor, modern-day Iznik in Turkey, in the summer of 1035 on his return journey from the Holy Land. He was probably 35 years old. The exact date of his death was most likely within the first few days of July, and the news, when it reached Normandy, fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples in every direction. William, who was at most 7 or 8 years old, was now the Duke of Normandy, and the troubles were only beginning. The death of Robert I threw Normandy into a state of profound instability. It is worth pausing here to understand just how precarious William's position was, and how important the people around him, including Herluin de Conteville, would prove to be in the years of crisis that followed. A child ruler in the feudal world of the 11th century was a gift to his enemies. The barons who had sworn loyalty to William as Robert's heir had done so under the personal authority of the living duke. With Robert dead and a 7-year-old boy wearing the ducal title, that authority was suddenly thin. Many of the great Norman magnates, men with their own territorial ambitions, their own rivalries, their own agendas, saw in William's minority an opportunity. Private castles began to be built without ducal permission, a direct violation of the laws of the duchy. Public authority, which depended on the duke's ability to enforce it, began to erode. Private warfare between rival barons broke out in various parts of the land. William needed guardians. His father had anticipated this to some extent by arranging the initial government of the duchy through a regent, his great-uncle Robert, Archbishop of Rouen, who stepped in to manage affairs in the young duke's name. But the archbishop died in 1037, just 2 years after Robert I himself, and his death removed one of William's most important protectors. From that point forward, the situation in Normandy deteriorated rapidly. A series of guardians attempted to protect William and govern the duchy in his name. The results were catastrophic. Alan, Duke of Brittany, who took on the guardianship of the young William, died before long. Gilbert of Brion, who succeeded him, was murdered in 1040, killed in the political violence that increasingly characterized the duchy's internal life. A guardian named Turchetil was also killed. Another, a man named Osborne, who served as the duke's steward, was stabbed to death in William's own bedchamber, while the boy slept in the same room. The killers came in the night and committed the deed just feet from the sleeping child. By the time William had reached his early teenage years, 3 of his guardians had died violent deaths, and his tutor had also been murdered. The danger was real and immediate. There were factions in Normandy that did not merely want to exploit the instability of the minority. They wanted William himself dead. An illegitimate child duke, killed or set aside, would open the door to other claimants, other arrangements. William's maternal uncle, Walter of Falaise, the brother of Herleva, understood this danger and acted decisively to prevent it. On at least one documented occasion, Walter seized William from his bed in the night and carried him in his arms to safety in the home of some poor people, hiding the boy among the peasantry, where his enemies would not think to look. It was a desperate measure, and it worked. William survived, but these years left marks on him that would never fully fade. The violence, the betrayals, the constant awareness that powerful men wished him ill, all of this shaped the character of the young man who would one day be known as the Conqueror. He learned early that the world was dangerous, that loyalty was precious and rare, and that a ruler who could not enforce his authority was a ruler in name only. Where does Herluin de Conteville fit into this picture? He is not a dramatic figure in William's minority. No chronicle places him at the centre of events in the way that Walter of Falaise or the various guardians are placed. But he is not absent either. The World History Encyclopedia, drawing on the chronicler sources, specifically names Herluin de Conteville among the powerful friends that William could call upon during the long years of disorder. He was, as the husband of William's mother, a man with a clear personal stake in the young Duke's survival and success. His lands and his position were tied by the bonds of family to William's fortunes. If William was destroyed, everything that Herluin had built, the marriage, the children, the modest but real place of the Conteville family in Norman society, was threatened too. This is not a small thing. In the volatile politics of William's minority, to have a loyal and settled lord, even a modest one, who could offer support, provide a safe place, lend his personal authority to the cause of stability, was genuinely valuable. Herluin may not have been one of the great magnates who could deliver armies, but he was someone William knew, someone whose loyalty was not in question, someone whose household was, in the deepest sense, a part of William's own world. And in those years of the 1040s, as William grew older and began cautiously to assert his own authority, such people mattered. By 1042, William had reached his 15th year, was formally knighted, most likely by his overlord, King Henry III of France, who had taken an interest in the stability of the neighbouring duchy, and began to take an active role in the governance of Normandy. But taking an active role did not mean that the crisis was immediately resolved. The disorder that had accumulated across the years of his minority was deep and systemic. Rebel barons had built illegal castles. Rival claimants had tested the boundaries of William's authority. The duchy needed to be brought to heel by force. The decisive moment came in 1047. A major rebellion, led in significant part by William's own cousin Guy of Burgundy, coalesced against the young duke, threatening to unseat him entirely. William appealed to his overlord, the French King Henry III, for military assistance. Henry responded. The two forces met the rebels at a place called Valais-Dune, near Caen, and in the battle that followed, William's army prevailed decisively. The rebellion was crushed. Guy of Burgundy was forced to submit, and for the first time, William could feel something like real authority in his duchy, the authority that came not merely from a title, but from demonstrated power. Herluin was among those on the side of order in those difficult years. He had been there quietly, through the worst of it, not as a hero, not as a dramatic saviour, but as a stable presence in an unstable world. His loyalty to his stepson was not loud or celebrated. It was the loyalty of a man who understood that the bonds of family and personal fidelity were the most fundamental bonds of the world he lived in. He had been true to those bonds, and the rewards, when they came, were quiet and appropriate for the kind of man he was. As William's grip on Normandy strengthened through the late 1040s and into the 1050s, the rewards of loyalty began to flow outward to those who had stood by him. For Herluin, the most significant of these rewards was the formal recognition of his title. He became, or was formally confirmed as, Viscount of Conteville. The sources suggest this title was probably created or confirmed by William himself. It was not a grand elevation. Herluin did not become a count or a powerful magnate overnight, but it was recognition. It was the Duke saying formally and publicly that this man was valued, that his service and loyalty were acknowledged, that the ties between them were real. Herluin also came to hold the honour of Sainte-Mère-Église, a portion of the county of Mortain, a territory in the south of Normandy, where he had a castle and established his household in the area. It was here, in this part of his expanded holdings, that Herluin would undertake the most lasting of his achievements, the founding of an abbey. But before we arrive at the abbey, we must speak of his children, the children of Herluin and Herleva, who were growing into young adulthood during these years of the late 1040s and 1050s, and who were, even then, beginning to reveal the extraordinary destinies that awaited them. Odo was the elder of the two main sons. He had grown up in the shadow of his remarkable half-brother and in the relative quietness of the household at Conteville, receiving whatever education was available to a Norman lord's son. Lessons in letters, in the arts of the church, in the management of ecclesiastical affairs. Normandy in this period was experiencing a genuine religious reform movement, with the great abbeys of the duchy, Bec, Fécamp, Jumièges, Mont Saint-Michel, producing scholars and administrators of real quality. The Reformed Church, influenced by the movements of Cluny in Burgundy, was producing a new kind of clergyman, better educated, more rigorous, more conscious of ecclesiastical discipline. Odo grew up in this world, and he absorbed its possibilities. What William saw in his young half-brother is not entirely clear from the historical record. Odo was perhaps 14 years old, possibly younger, when William made him Bishop of Bayeux, sometime around the year 1049. This was, by any standard, an extraordinary appointment. It placed enormous ecclesiastical authority and considerable wealth in the hands of a boy who was barely past childhood. It was also, in the unashamed terms of the Norman world, a political appointment, the kind of thing that the great reformers of the Church were beginning to criticize. The placement of high ecclesiastical office in the hands of men chosen for their family connections and political usefulness, rather than their spiritual qualifications. But William was not making the appointment on spiritual grounds. He was making it on practical ones. He needed Bayeux, one of the richest and most important sees in Normandy, in the hands of someone absolutely loyal to him. And Odo, whatever his spiritual qualifications, was his brother. The loyalty was guaranteed. The appointment of Odo to Bayeux was not merely a favour to a half-brother. It was the beginning of a political partnership that would define the next several decades of Norman, and eventually English, history. And it was rooted, at least in part, in the household that Herluin had provided. The boy Odo had grown up in had been Herluin's house. The values of loyalty and family solidarity that drove William to trust his half-brother with such a significant appointment had their origins in those early shared years in Conteville. Robert, meanwhile, the younger of Herluin's two sons, born perhaps a year or two after Odo, was following a different path. He was becoming a military man. He was being drawn into the orbit of William's expanding duchy, not as a churchman, but as a soldier and an administrator of territory. Around the year 1049, William granted Robert the county of Mortain, a significant territorial holding in the south of Normandy, on the borders of Brittany and the county of Belém. It was a strategically important gift. Mortain sat at a point where Norman authority met the complex borders of rival powers, and William needed someone there whom he could trust absolutely. He chose his half-brother, Herluin's son, so within a few years of each other, both of Herluin's sons by Herleva had been elevated to positions of real power in Normandy, one as a bishop commanding the wealth and authority of one of the duchy's great sees, one as a count holding a strategically critical border territory. The modest Norman lord who had married the duke's former mistress had, through his sons, become the father of two of the most powerful men in the duchy. It is worth pausing on what this meant for Herluin himself. He did not suddenly become grand. He was still the Viscount of Conteville, a man of moderate means and limited territorial extent. But he was now also the father of a bishop and a count, and the stepfather of the duke. In the intensely personal world of Norman feudal politics, that made him something more than his lands alone would suggest. He was a man of connection, of relationship, of family. And in that world, family was power of a particular kind. Herleva was still alive through at least some of these years. She had watched her sons grow and be elevated, had perhaps celebrated quietly in her own way the remarkable distances they had travelled from the modest household at Conteville. She had borne Herluin children and built a life with him, and that life had been, by all the evidence, a settled and respectful one. But around the year 1050, Herleva of Falaise died. We know this not because any chronicle records her death with precision, but because of an inference that historians have drawn from the evidence of the abbey that Herluin was about to build. When Grestain Abbey was founded, around 1050, its records of benefactors include not Herleva, but a woman named Fredescendis, who is identified as Herluin's wife. If Fredescendis was Herluin's wife at the time of the abbey's founding, then Herleva must have already died. The date of c. 1050 is thus deduced, not directly recorded, but it is the best estimate the evidence allows us to make. Herleva of Falaise, the woman who had captured the attention of a duke, born the man who would conquer England, and lived out her later years in the quietness of a Norman lord's household, was buried at Grestain Abbey. Her resting place was confirmed by an ancient document called the Mortuary Rolls of St. Vitalis, dated 1123, which are today preserved in the French National Library. She lies there still, or rather, the ruins of the place where she was laid to rest still exist, surrounded by the remnants of the church that her husband built. The founding of Grestain Abbey is the most enduring of Herluin de Conteville's legacies. It is the deed by which he is most often remembered, when he is remembered at all. And the story of its founding, part historical fact, part sacred legend, is one of the more remarkable fragments of the narrative that surrounds this quiet Norman lord. The legend begins with a sickness. Herluin, at some point in the years around 1050, was afflicted with leprosy. Leprosy was one of the most feared diseases of the medieval world, a slow and disfiguring illness that attacked the body over years and decades, causing damage to the nerves and the skin and the extremities, and which carried with it an enormous social stigma. Lepers in medieval society were often required to live apart from the community, to carry a bell to warn of their approach, to be considered ritually unclean. For a man of Herluin's modest but real social standing, such an affliction would have been both physically terrible and socially devastating. According to the tradition associated with Grestain Abbey, a tradition preserved in the abbey's own founding records and in the accounts passed down through the religious community that inhabited it, Herluin, sick and suffering, received a vision. The Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to him and instructed him to seek out a particular spring in the valley of Vilaine, near the place that would become Grestain. The waters of this spring, fed by the stream known as the Carbeg, a name meaning the stream of Kari, were said to have healing properties. Herluin followed the instruction of the vision, bathed in or drank the waters of the spring, and was cured of his illness. In gratitude and in fulfillment of what he understood to be divine direction, Herluin resolved to build an abbey on the site. He founded what would become the Abbey of Notre-Dame de Grestain, the Abbey of Our Lady of Grestain, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the figure who had appeared to him in his need. The founding took place around 1050, and the Herluin's son, Robert, now Count of Mortain, was involved in the establishment of the new religious house alongside his father. Grestain was established as a Benedictine monastery, a community following the rule of St. Benedict, one of the oldest and most respected traditions of Christian monasticism in Europe. The Benedictines had been the great monastics of the early medieval world, their abbeys serving as centres of prayer, learning, agricultural productivity, and cultural preservation across the centuries since Benedict himself had written his rule in the 6th century. In Norman Normandy, Benedictine abbeys were the dominant form of religious life, and new foundations carried with them a kind of social and spiritual prestige, a visible demonstration of the piety and generosity of their founders. The physical location of Grestain was beautiful, a valley nestled among wooded hills, crossed by the healing stream, close enough to the Seine's estuary that the sound of water was a constant presence, not far from the later town of Honfleur, which sits at the mouth of the Seine on the Normandy coast. The abbey occupied a peaceful and somewhat secluded location. It was, in many ways, the perfect place for a religious community devoted to contemplation and prayer, and, as it turned out, for a family burial ground, because from its founding, Grestain was not merely an abbey, it was the spiritual home of the House of Conteville. Herluin himself would eventually be buried there, beside his wife or wives. Herleva, whose burial at Grestain is confirmed by the 1123 mortuary rolls, was laid to rest there, and a monument was later erected to the memory of the family, commemorating Arlette, Herluin, and others of their kin. Robert of Mortain, when he died around 1095, was buried at Grestain too, beside his first wife Matilda de Montgomery. The abbey grew in the decades after its founding. It accumulated lands and endowments, the generous gifts of Norman nobles, who wished to associate themselves with a house so closely connected to the Duke's own family. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, Grestain's English connections grew significantly. Many of the churches mentioned in the Great Domesday Survey of 1086 cite Grestain as their founding establishment. The abbots of Grestain ordained English priests. The abbey established daughter priories on English soil. In this way, the modest Benedictine house that a leprosy-stricken Norman lord had built beside a healing stream became one of the institutional threads connecting Normandy to post-conquest England across the following centuries. Herluin married again after Herleva's death. His second wife was named Fredezendis, and she appears in the historical record as a benefactor of Grestain Abbey and as Herluin's wife in a confirmation charter of the abbey dated 1189. Fredezendis bore Herluin at least 2 sons, Raoul de Conteville, who survived into the later 11th century and held land in Somerset and Devon, and Jean de Conteville, who appears to have died young. Very little else is recorded about the children of this second marriage. With Herleva gone and the abbey built, Herluin settled into the final phase of his life, a phase that must have been, in its own quiet way, one of considerable satisfaction. His sons had risen to the very heights of Norman power. His stepson was the dominant force in the duchy, a man whose ambitions were now turning towards something even larger than Normandy. The abbey he had founded was growing and flourishing. His second wife was established beside him, and the world, for the moment, was at a kind of peace. The year 1066 is one of the most famous in European history. It is the year that William, Duke of Normandy, Herluin's stepson, the son of Herleva, the boy who had grown up partly in the shadow of that modest household at Conteville, made his bid for the crown of England. And it is the year in which Herluin de Conteville died. These two facts are connected only by the calendar. We do not know exactly when in 1066 Herluin died. whether it was early in the year, before the great events of October, or late in the year, after them. We do not know the cause of his death. We know only that he died in that extraordinary year and was buried at Grestain, and that the duchy and the world he left behind was in the process of being transformed beyond anything he could have imagined when he first married Herleva of Falaise some 35 years before. To understand the significance of what happened in 1066, we need to briefly step back and trace the path that had brought William to the threshold of England. In the years following the crisis of his minority, William had not merely stabilized Normandy. He had expanded it, strengthened it, and made it the most powerful duchy in France. He had defeated repeated challenges from French kings and rival Norman magnates. He had brought the Counts of Maine under his control. He had formed strategic alliances, including his marriage to Matilda of Flanders, a match that connected him to one of the great powers of Northern Europe and eventually produced a formidable family of sons and daughters. By the early 1060s, William was the most powerful ruler in northern France, a man who had transformed a duchy in crisis into a model of feudal governance, and he wanted England. His claim to the English throne had its roots in a network of dynastic connections and personal promises that were, even by the standards of medieval politics, somewhat complicated. The English king Edward the Confessor, who had spent years of his youth in exile in Normandy and had strong Norman sympathies, was William's first cousin once removed. Edward had no children and was aging without an heir. In 1051, it was widely understood, though disputed, that Edward had designated William as his successor. In 1064, the great English Earl Harold Godwinson had visited Normandy under circumstances that remained somewhat murky, and had sworn an oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, Harold Godwinson immediately claimed the throne for himself. The English Royal Council, the Witan, supported him. Harold was crowned king within days of Edward's death. William was furious. He began planning an invasion. The scale of what William undertook in the months that followed is staggering. He had to build or commission an invasion fleet, hundreds of ships capable of carrying thousands of fighting men, horses, weapons, and supplies across the Channel. He had to secure the political and military backing of his Norman barons, who were being asked to risk their lives and fortunes on a venture of enormous uncertainty. He had to obtain the blessing of the papacy. Pope Alexander II endorsed William's claim, turning the invasion into something that could be presented as a holy cause. He had to assemble allies from beyond Normandy itself, drawing in fighters from Brittany, Flanders, and other regions of France, and he had to count on his half-brothers. At the Great Council held at Lillebonne, where William laid out his plans to his assembled barons, both Odo and Robert were present. They were central to the planning and the commitment. Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, one of the richest and most powerful men in Normandy, contributed ships and resources to the invasion fleet. He used his administrative genius and his considerable wealth to help organize and equip the enterprise. He was not merely a supporter, he was an active planner and enabler. Robert of Mortain went further still. According to a Norman chronicle, Robert personally pledged 120 ships to William's invasion fleet. 120 ships. This was more than any other single Norman magnate contributed to the venture. More than any count or baron or bishop. Herluin's son, the boy who had grown up in the modest household at Conteville, who had been elevated to the county of Mortain by his grateful half-brother, provided the single largest individual contribution to the armada that would carry Norman power to England. 120 ships. It is a number that deserves to be held for a moment, to be felt in its full weight. Each ship had to be built or acquired, crewed, provisioned, and launched. Each ship carried men and horses and supplies. The logistics alone were staggering, and it was Robert of Mortain, Herluin's son, who provided more of those ships than anyone else alive. The fleet gathered in the harbour of Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, waiting for favourable winds. The winds did not come immediately. Day after day, the great armada sat at anchor, while William fretted and his men's patience wore thin. Then, in late September, the wind shifted. The order was given. The ships set sail. William and his staff, which included both his half-brothers, Bishop Odo and Robert of Mortain, sailed on William's own flagship, a vessel called the Mora. The Channel crossing was made successfully, and the Norman fleet landed at Pevensey on the coast of Sussex on the 28th of September, 1066. The campaign that followed moved quickly. Harold, who had just defeated a Norwegian invasion force in the north of England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, marched his army south at remarkable speed to meet the Norman threat. The two armies met at Senlac Hill, near the town of Hastings, on the 14th of October, 1066. The Battle of Hastings lasted most of a day. Harold's English army held a defensive position on a ridge, their shield wall presenting a formidable obstacle to the Norman attackers. For much of the morning, the Norman assaults failed to break through. Then, gradually, through a combination of Norman archery, cavalry, and, according to some accounts, a feigned retreat that drew part of the English line out of position, the shield wall began to weaken. Harold himself was killed, most likely toward the end of the fighting, struck, in the famous tradition, by an arrow, though the precise circumstances of his death remain debated. With their king dead, the English resistance collapsed. Odo of Bayeux was present at the battle. The Bayeux Tapestry, the great embroidered narrative of the Conquest, which preserves extraordinary visual detail of the campaign, depicts him at Hastings, mounted on a horse, wielding not a sword, but a staff or club. The detail is often interpreted as a deliberate artistic choice, suggesting that as a churchman, Odo could not technically shed blood, but could still participate vigorously in the fighting. He is shown at the centre of the action, encouraging the troops, a formidable presence. Robert of Mortain was also present. The tapestry shows him at the dinner at Pevensey on the day of the landing, seated with his brothers, depicted together, these three sons of Herleva, planning the conquest of a kingdom. Robert had himself recorded, in a later document granting lands to St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, that he had fought at the Battle of Hastings. It was a point of pride. He had been there. He had contributed his ships. He had made the crossing. He had fought on the field. The conquest of England was partly his. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey. He was the first Norman King of England, and his coronation set in motion a transformation of English society, language, law, and culture, whose effects are still visible 1,000 years later. Herluin de Conteville did not see any of this. He had died before the year was out, before the fleet sailed, or as it gathered, or perhaps just after the news of Hastings arrived in Normandy. We do not know. We know only that he died in 1066, and that the sons he had raised went on to stand in the centre of one of history's most consequential battles. The quiet lord of Conteville, who had married a duke's former mistress and built an abbey and raised his children in the modest rhythms of a Norman lord's life, had been, in a way he could never have planned or predicted, a father of the Norman conquest. Because Herluin's story does not end with his death, it continues through the lives of his sons, whose careers extended across the decades that followed 1066, reshaping England and Normandy in ways that no single man could have anticipated. We must follow those sons into the world they helped to make. Odo of Bayeux is, of the two, the more vivid personality. He is a man who leaps off the pages of the chronicles with a kind of irresistible energy. Ambitious, clever, generous, ruthless, pious and worldly in almost equal measure. A figure who embodied the contradictions of the Norman world he inhabited. In the immediate aftermath of the Conquest, Odo was William's primary agent in England. The year after Hastings, in 1067, William made Odo Earl of Kent, assigning to him the responsibility of governing the southeastern corner of England. This was a critical appointment. Kent was the most exposed part of England to contact with the continent, the county through which Norman traffic flowed in both directions across the Channel. Whoever governed Kent governed the corridor of communication between England and Normandy. It was, strategically, one of the most important positions in the new kingdom, and Odo ran it with remarkable effectiveness. He served as one of William's three principal administrators in England, effectively governing the kingdom during William's frequent absences in Normandy. He was, for a period, the second most powerful man in William's realm, outranked only by the king himself, wealthier than almost any other magnate, a figure of extraordinary influence in both ecclesiastical and political life. It was in these years of English administration that Odo undertook what would become his most famous and enduring achievement, the commissioning of the Bayeux Tapestry. The tapestry, which is actually not a tapestry at all in the technical sense, but an extraordinary embroidery, needleworked in coloured wool on a linen backing, is one of the great artistic documents of the medieval world. It stretches nearly 70 metres in length and depicts, in a continuous visual narrative of remarkable detail and energy, the events that led to the Norman conquest and the conquest itself. The scholarly consensus, supported by the tapestry's stylistic connections to the Anglo-Saxon embroidery tradition of Canterbury, where Odo had significant ecclesiastical connections, is that it was made in England, probably at Canterbury, and that it was commissioned by Odo himself, most likely to adorn his cathedral at Bayeux, for the cathedral's formal dedication in 1077. This dedication would have been a great occasion, a moment of public celebration of Norman achievement, and what better way to mark it than with a visual record of the great deed that had made everything possible. Odo appears prominently in the tapestry, more prominently, some have argued, than even William himself in certain scenes. He is there at the feast at Pevensey, seated with his brothers. He is there at Hastings, his staff raised. He is depicted as a man of energy and presence, a figure of central importance to the story the tapestry tells. But the tapestry was made, it seems, after the high point of Odo's fortunes, because in the early 1080s, Odo fell from grace, and fell hard. The exact nature of his offence remains somewhat mysterious. What is clear is that around 1082 or 1083, William had Odo arrested on the Isle of Wight, apparently while Odo was in the process of recruiting an armed force, apparently with the aim of leading a military expedition to Italy. The most intriguing possibility is that Odo was angling for the papacy, that he intended to march to Rome and use his military force to install himself or support a candidate for the position of pope. It is an audacious ambition, even by the standards of the age. William was furious. He had Odo imprisoned. The imprisonment lasted 5 years. Even William's senior advisors, the chroniclers tell us, were nervous about taking such drastic action against a bishop, a man under the protection of the church. But William reportedly silenced the objections by pointing out that he was not imprisoning the Bishop of Bayeux. He was imprisoning the Earl of Kent. The distinction, in William's view, made the arrest permissible under secular rather than ecclesiastical law. Odo remained imprisoned for 5 years, until William lay dying at Rouen in September of 1087. On his deathbed, William was persuaded to release his half-brother, the persuasion coming in part from Robert of Mortain, who interceded on Odo's behalf. William relented. Odo was freed. After William's death, the English throne passed to William's third son, William Rufus, while the Duchy of Normandy went to William's eldest son, Robert Curthose. Odo sided with Robert Curthose, supporting the Duke of Normandy's claim to the English throne in the rebellion of 1088, which ultimately failed. Odo was permitted to leave England after the rebellion's collapse, and he attached himself to Robert Curthose's court in Normandy. In 1096, Robert Curthose took the cross and set out for the Holy Land on the First Crusade. Odo went with him. It was a remarkable gesture for a man who was by this point in his mid-60s, an elderly bishop by medieval standards, setting out on the most demanding and dangerous journey imaginable. He died before he reached Jerusalem. In January or February of 1097, Odo of Bayeux died at Palermo in Sicily on his way to the crusade. He was buried in Palermo Cathedral. He had been, in his long and turbulent life, a bishop and an earl, an administrator and a warrior, a man of God and a man of the world in equal and sometimes contradictory measure. He had commissioned what is arguably the most important visual document of the medieval period. He had governed England. He had raised armies. He had plotted for the papacy. He had been imprisoned by his own king. And in the end, he had set out for Jerusalem as an old man and died in Sicily before he could get there. He was the son of Herluin de Conteville and Herleva of Falaise. He had grown up in a modest Norman lord's household, somewhere near the bending of the Seine, and from that modest beginning, he had built one of the most extraordinary careers of the 11th century. Robert of Mortain was, in many ways, a different kind of man from his brother Odo. Where Odo was vivid and dramatic, a figure of intense personality, whose career swung between great heights and humiliating depths, Robert was steadier, more consistent, more loyal, less prone to the grand gesture of ambition that ultimately destroyed Odo's standing with William. The chronicler, William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century, described Robert as not a man of great wisdom. It is not a flattering assessment, but it should not be read as a complete dismissal. What Malmesbury probably meant was that Robert was not the kind of subtle, politically sophisticated operator that the most successful medieval magnates needed to be. He was not a schemer. He was not, in the mold of Odo, a man of multiple layers of agenda. He was, in the best sense of a word, that had genuine meaning in the 11th century, loyal. He had demonstrated that loyalty most dramatically, of course, with those 120 ships. That contribution to the invasion fleet was the defining moment of Robert's pre-conquest career, the point at which he committed himself utterly to his half-brother's venture, putting his resources and his person at William's disposal in the most literal possible way. After the conquest, William rewarded Robert with extraordinary generosity. The Domesday Book of 1086, the great survey of English landholding ordered by William to assess the resources of his new kingdom, records Robert of Mortain as one of the greatest landholders in England. He held manors in Cornwall, 248 of them, making him effectively the dominant lord of that county, and significant holdings in Yorkshire, Northamptonshire, Devon, Sussex, Dorset, Buckinghamshire, and 10 other counties besides. The sheer scale of Robert's landholding after the conquest is almost impossible to overstate. He was, in terms of the land he held in England alone, one of the wealthiest men in the realm. He also received, at some point in the post-conquest years, the title of Earl of Cornwall. the first holder of that earldom in its post-conquest form. Cornwall, that distinctive peninsula in the far southwest of England, with its ancient Celtic identity and its striking landscape of granite moors and sea-battered coastlines, became, in a real sense, Robert's domain. But Robert did not spend his time in England. He remained, for much of his later life, in Normandy, managing his affairs from his continental base, leaving the administration of his English lands to subordinates. This was not unusual for Norman magnates of the period, many of whom held lands on both sides of the Channel and divided their time accordingly. The Channel was an obstacle, but it was not an impassable one, and the Norman world was in many senses a world that straddled it. In 1069, Robert was called upon to defend his half-brother's kingdom against a Danish attempt to take advantage of English unrest. Edgar Atheling, the last surviving member of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, had staged a rebellion in the north of England, and a Danish fleet had arrived in support. Robert, together with another Norman commander named Robert of Bayeux, led an army against the Danish force in Lindsey in Lincolnshire. They defeated it decisively. The Danish threat was dispersed. Around 1082, Robert and his wife founded a collegiate church at Saint-Evroult at Mortain, another act of piety, another addition to the religious landscape that the family of Conteville was creating on both sides of the Channel. Robert's relationship with his brother Odo remained close through these years. When Odo was arrested by William in 1082 or 1083, it was Robert who interceded, who went to the king's deathbed in 1087 and urged William to release his imprisoned brother. William agreed. The bond between the two sons of Herluin and Herleva was the bond of men who had grown up together, who had shared childhood and family and the particular intimacy of a household. And that bond, even under the strain of Odo's imprisonment and William's anger, proved strong enough to survive. After William's death in September 1087, Robert, like Odo, sided with Robert Curthose in the succession struggle that followed. The rebellion of 1088, which aimed to place Robert Curthose on the English throne instead of William Rufus, involved both brothers. Robert held Pevensey Castle as a key stronghold during the rebellion. When the rebellion failed, William Rufus showed a degree of clemency. Robert was forgiven and allowed to retain most of his lands in England. Robert of Mortain died around 1095. The exact date is uncertain. Some sources give December 9th of that year, but this precision cannot be confirmed from reliable sources. He was buried at Grestain Abbey, beside his parents, in the church that his father had built beside the healing spring. His wife, Matilda de Montgomery, daughter of the first Earl of Shrewsbury, was buried there with him. The dynasty of Conteville had come full circle. The father who had founded the abbey was gone. The sons who had conquered England were gone too. And at Grestain, in the valley of Vilaine, beside the Carbec stream, the family lay together in the quiet of the stone church that Herluin had built when he saw a vision of the Virgin Mary in his sickness and decided to build something lasting in gratitude. It is worth pausing here, before we move to the final reflections of Herluin's story, to think about the Bayeux Tapestry itself, not simply as a historical document, but as a kind of family portrait, because the tapestry, if we read it with attention to its human dimension, is in many ways the visual record of a family, the family that Herluin and Herleva made. The tapestry was, in all likelihood, commissioned by Odo of Bayeux, Herluin's son, Herleva's child, William's half-brother. It was made to celebrate the Conquest, to tell its story in images that anyone who looked upon them would understand. It hangs in the museum at Bayeux today, nearly 1,000 years after it was made, and it is still one of the most visited and most studied objects in the history of medieval art. But look at what it contains. William the Conqueror is at its centre. The man who led the conquest, who claimed the crown, who changed England forever. He was born to Herleva before she married Herluin. He is the elder half-brother. And beside him, in the tapestry's visual narrative, we see Odo, Herluin's son, riding at Hastings with his staff. And in the scene of the dinner at Pevensey, on the night of the landing in England, we see three men seated together: William, Odo, and Robert, three sons of Herleva, three men raised in the orbit of Herluin's household. The tapestry is, among many other things, the story of what happened when the sons of a modest Norman lord and the stepson that lord had taken under his roof went to war together. Odo almost certainly commissioned the tapestry for the dedication of his cathedral at Bayeux in 1077. The dedication was a grand occasion, the formal opening of a great new church, the culmination of years of construction and planning. To adorn such a space with a 70-metre embroidered narrative of the Norman conquest was an act of enormous cultural ambition. It placed Odo's name and Odo's family at the visual centre of the conquest memory. Some scholars have even speculated that the tapestry was made partly as a political statement, not just a celebration, but a plea. By the time the tapestry was being sewn, sometime in the 1070s, Odo was already navigating the complexities of his relationship with William. The tapestry, in this reading, was a way of reminding everyone, including William, of just how central Odo had been to the enterprise that had made everything possible. "Look," the tapestry says silently, "this is what we did. This is what I did. Do not forget." Whether or not that interpretation is correct, the tapestry endures. It is Odo's most lasting monument, more lasting than his earldom of Kent, more lasting than his administration of England, more lasting than his ambitions in Italy. It is 70 meters of wool on linen, and it has outlasted almost everything else of his time by 9 centuries, and it was made by the son of Herluin de Conteville. Grestain Abbey survived for more than 7 centuries after Herluin built it, through the Norman period, through the Plantagenet centuries, through the complex religious and political upheavals of the later medieval world. The abbey maintained its identity as a Benedictine house closely associated with the memory of the family that had founded it. The abbey developed steadily in the years after the conquest. Its English connections, the daughter priories, the churches cited in the Domesday Book as deriving from Grestain's founding, gave it a presence on both sides of the Channel. The abbots of Grestain held real authority in the Norman ecclesiastical world, and the house continued to receive gifts and endowments from the descendants of the original Norman settlers in England, who maintained ties to Normandy. The memory of Herluin and Herleva was preserved in the abbey's own traditions. The founding legend, the leprosy, the vision, the healing spring, the Virgin Mary's promise, was kept alive in the community's oral and written records. A monument was eventually erected to the family, commemorating Arlette, the name by which Herleva was sometimes known in French tradition, Herluin, and Robert of Mortain. The inscription on that monument, placed centuries after the deaths it commemorated, spoke of the founders' resting place and of the ties that bound them to the history of the Norman world. The abbey was formally closed in 1757 on the orders of the bishop as part of a broader reorganization of religious houses in France. The church buildings were demolished around 1766, and the remaining structures were destroyed during the French Revolution, around 1790. Today, only ruins remain, integrated into the grounds of a private property called the Château de la Pommeraye. A defensive wall, a 13th century portal, portions of an 18th century manor building with a medieval floor, and fragments of the original church are all that physically survive of what Herluin built. But the site has not been forgotten. A monument stands in what remains of the abbey grounds, dedicated to the memory of the founders. Herleva, Arlette, as the local tradition calls her, is particularly remembered. She is in many ways the most accessible and the most beloved figure of the story. The young woman from Falaise who caught a duke's attention, who bore the conqueror, and who found a measure of peace and dignity in marriage to a quiet Norman lord. Her name is preserved in the local landscape, in the traditions of the region, in the stone memorial at what remains of Grestain, the abbey's healing spring, the stream at Carbec, which the founding legend credits with curing Herluin's leprosy, still flows. The park of the old abbey, wooded and crossed by the stream, retains something of the quality that the original founders must have recognized when they chose the site. It is still possible, standing in that valley in Upper Normandy, to imagine the early years of the foundation, the monks at their prayers, the spring flowing, the wooden buildings of the first community gradually giving way to stone, the hills green above and the Seine not far beyond. The Normandy Tourism Authority today describes the site as a place of memory and reflection, one of the many landmarks of the Norman heritage that connects the modern region to its 11th century origins. Grestain is listed as part of the Route des Abbayes Normands, the route of Norman abbeys, a cultural itinerary through the religious landscape of Upper Normandy. It is, in the end, what remains of Herluin. Not a great castle, not a famous battlefield, not a chronicle filled with his deeds. A ruined abbey beside a healing spring, surrounded by wooded hills, where a family that helped shape the history of England was laid to rest. What, in the end, do we make of Herluin de Conteville? He is not a famous man. He does not appear on lists of the great figures of the Norman Conquest. He is not the subject of biographies or popular histories. He appears in the footnotes of the larger stories, William's story, Odo's story, Robert's story, Herleva's story, as a background figure, a quiet presence in someone else's drama. And yet he was not insignificant. He was, in fact, something that the medieval world understood and valued even when it did not always celebrate. A man of constancy, a man who could be trusted. Consider what Herluin did and what it required of him. He accepted, at a time when he was already an established adult with his own life and household, a woman who came with the most complicated of histories, a duke's former mistress, already the mother of a boy who was also the duke's only son. He accepted her, he married her, he gave her a home and a family, and the dignity of a legitimate life. He raised her children alongside his own. He was present, steadily and quietly, through the years of William's perilous minority, when the world around them was violent and uncertain. He founded an abbey that became a place of beauty and memory and prayer, and he died in the year that his stepson conquered England, never knowing the full measure of what his family had helped to bring about. He is the quiet centre of an extraordinary storm, the calm point around which everything moved. In the Norman world, this kind of constancy was deeply valued, even when it was not loudly celebrated. The feudal bond, the bond of loyalty between lord and vassal, between man and man, was the fundamental social glue of the world Herluin inhabited. It was not always honoured, as the murders and rebellions of William's minority proved, but when it was honoured, when a man truly was what he pledged to be, loyal, steady, trustworthy, it was the most precious thing in the world. Herluin was that. He was what he pledged to be. He was also something that medieval men did not always talk about explicitly, but that the best of them practiced. He was a generous husband and a good father. The sons he raised, not just Odo and Robert, but the stepson William, who spent at least some of his childhood years in proximity to that household, grew up knowing what family loyalty looked like. They grew up with an example of how a man could behave toward those in his care. And when those sons, grown to men, stood together at Pevensey before the greatest military venture of their age, and when they sat together in the Tapestry's famous dinner scene, with the fires of England already burning in the background of their plans, the bond between them was the bond of men who had been shaped by the same household, the same mother, the same stepfather's quiet example. It is not too much to say that without Herluin, without his willingness to accept Herleva and give her sons a stable home, without his steady presence during the years of William's minority, without the household at Conteville that gave the half-brothers a shared ground, the story of 1066 might have looked different, not dramatically different perhaps. William was a force of nature who would have found his way regardless, but the particular texture of the conquest, the partnership between William and his half-brothers, the trust and loyalty that made that partnership function, the family bonds that held under pressure, those were rooted, at least in part, in Conteville. Herluin built those roots. He did not do it grandly. He did not do it with armies or with chronicles or with famous speeches preserved for posterity. He did it in the way that the best things are done, quietly, consistently, day by day, year by year, in the small acts of ordinary faithfulness that history rarely remembers, but that matter more than almost anything else. The story of the family of Conteville did not end with Herluin's death, or with the deaths of Odo and Robert. It continued into the next generation and beyond, threading through the complex dynastic history of England and Normandy in ways that Herluin himself could never have anticipated. Robert of Mortain's son, William, Count of Mortain, inherited his father's title and some of his lands after Robert's death around 1095. But the younger William made choices that his father had, on the whole, managed to avoid. He backed the wrong side at a critical moment, supporting Robert Curthose against Henry III of England in the years after William Rufus's death in 1100. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, when Henry III's forces met and defeated the army of Robert Curthose. William, Count of Mortain, was captured at Tinchebray and spent the rest of his life in imprisonment. The county of Mortain and the great English estates that Robert had accumulated were lost. The most direct line of descent from Herluin de Conteville through Robert was effectively ended in political terms by that defeat. Odo, of course, had died without legitimate heirs. Bishops were supposed to be celibate, and while the historical record is not entirely silent on the subject of Odo's private life, he had no acknowledged legitimate children to carry on his name. The daughters of Herluin and Herleva married into Norman noble families. Emma, who married Richard Le Goz, Viscount of Avranches, produced descendants who became part of the broader Norman noble world. The other daughters' lines are more obscure in the historical record. The sons of Herluin's second marriage, Raoul de Conteville, who held land in Somerset and Devon, and Jean de Conteville, who died young, left their own faint marks in the records of post-conquest England, names in documents and landholding records that testify to the continued presence of the Conteville family name in the new world that William had made. But in the larger sense, the family of Conteville lived on not in direct descent, but in the institutions they had created and the events they had shaped. Grestain Abbey endured for centuries. The Bayeux Tapestry endured forever. The Norman Conquest itself, the most fundamental transformation of English history since the Roman withdrawal, was in part their work. Every English king from William I onward was, directly or indirectly, connected to the story that had begun in the modest household of a Norman viscount south of the Seine. England as we know it, the English language that absorbed thousands of Norman French words, the common law that developed from Norman administrative practice, the castles that dot the landscape, the cathedral towns that grew under Norman patronage, the very institutions of government that descend in unbroken line from the Norman settlement of the 11th century. All of this traces back, in some measure, to 1066, and 1066, in some measure, traces back to Conteville. We return, at the end, to the valley of Vilaine. It is still there. The stream, the wooded hills, the remnants of the abbey, the park where the ruins of the church stand among the trees. The Carbec stream still flows, as it has flowed since before Herluin built his abbey beside it. The hills of Upper Normandy rise in the background, green and gentle, the same hills that Herleva would have seen from the windows of whatever buildings stood at Conteville, the same hills that Robert of Mortain grew up looking at, the same hills that the first monks of Grestain walked among as they established their community and began their centuries of prayer. Herluin asked the Virgin Mary, in the legend of the abbey's founding, to cure his leprosy. He was told to bathe in the spring. He did. He was cured. And in gratitude, he built. Whether the miracle happened as the tradition says it did, we cannot know. What we can know is that the gratitude was real, or at least that the act of building was real, and that the act of building expressed something Herluin genuinely felt. He was not a man who made grand gestures. The founding of an abbey was perhaps the grandest thing he ever did, and he did it not in celebration of military victory or political triumph. He did it in gratitude for having survived, for having been given more time, for having, against the odds of illness and the passage of years, continued to live in the world he had been given. There is something moving in that, something that speaks to a quality in Herluin that the chronicles do not quite capture, but that the abbey itself expresses. He was a man who knew the value of what he had, the wife he had been given, the children she had borne him, the stepson who trusted him, the abbey he built, the quiet life in the modest holdings south of the Seine. He knew the value of it, and he was grateful for it. The monument at Grestain records his name alongside Herleva's, alongside the name of the woman who had been the centre of it all, the woman whose remarkable life had drawn all these threads together. She had begun as a girl in Falaise, the daughter of a man who processed the bodies of the dead or cured the hides of animals, depending on which historian you believe. She had become the mistress of a duke. She had borne the future King of England. She had been married to a quiet lord who gave her dignity and children and a home. She had died at approximately 45 years of age, somewhere in the fields of Normandy, and been laid to rest in the abbey her husband had built. The mortuary rolls of St. Vitalis, dated 1123, and now preserved in the French National Library, confirm her burial there. An ancient roll of the dead, recording who lies where, in which house of God, and Herleva's name is in it, as real and present as the stone over her grave. She is remembered now, more than she once was. The scholars who have studied her life in recent decades, the medievalists who have examined the chronicles and the charters and the genealogical traditions with careful attention, have restored something of her story to legibility. She was not simply a colourful anecdote in William the Conqueror's biography. She was a woman of considerable resilience and adaptability, who navigated an extraordinarily complex life with a dignity that the limited sources allow us to glimpse rather than fully see. And Herluin, her husband, the quiet lord, the man who gave her that dignity, is remembered too, if less often. His name is on the abbey he built. His name is in the chronicle accounts of William's minority, identified as one of the powerful friends who helped the young duke survive. His name is on the genealogical tables that trace the descent of the greatest families of Norman England. He was not famous. He did not seek fame. He sought, perhaps, what most people seek: a decent life, a loving family, a good death, and a place to be remembered. The abbey he built gave him the last of those, at least. The ruins of Grestain are still there. Herluin is still there, in a sense, in the stone and the stream and the wooded valley where his abbey once stood. Before we close tonight's story, let us take a moment to reflect on something that Herluin's life illuminates, something that is often missed in the great sweeping narratives of medieval history. We tend to remember the famous. We remember William the Conqueror because he conquered England. We remember Odo of Bayeux because he probably commissioned the tapestry. We remember Robert of Mortain because Domesday Book lists his name among the greatest landholders in a transformed kingdom. We remember Herleva, at least in outline, because she was the mother of a conqueror. But Herluin, the quiet centre of it all, is barely remembered, and when he is, it is usually as a footnote. There is a kind of historical injustice in this, not a dramatic injustice, not a wrong that requires correcting in any urgent sense, but a gentle injustice, the kind that the historical record perpetuates routinely, privileging the loud and the powerful and the dramatic over the steady and the faithful and the quiet. Herluin de Conteville was not a great man in the way that medieval historians defined greatness, by military victories, by the extent of territories governed, by the chronicles written in a man's honour. He was great in a different way. He was great in the way that fathers and husbands and steady lords can be great, by being exactly what the people in their care needed them to be, at the moment they were needed, without requiring celebration or commemoration. The world is full of such people in every age, the people who are not in the front of the frame, but who hold the frame together, the people without whom the dramatic events of history could not have unfolded as they did, because the ordinary infrastructure of loyalty and care and constancy that they provided would have been missing. Herluin was one of those people. He married a woman who needed to be married with dignity. He raised her children alongside his own. He stood as a quiet ally during the most dangerous years of a child duke's minority. He built an abbey that endured for 7 centuries and became a place of beauty and prayer and family memory. He died in the year that the world he had helped to create reached its most dramatic expression. And he did all of it without, as far as we can tell, any particular expectation of recognition. That, perhaps, is the most Norman thing about him. The Normans, at their best, were men of action, men who did what needed to be done and then moved on to the next thing that needed to be done. They were not, on the whole, great reflectors or great mourners of their own passage. They built things, fought things, married things, founded things, and kept moving. The chronicle of a man's life was less important to them than the thing itself, the doing of it. Herluin built his abbey. He married his wife. He raised his sons. He kept faith with his stepson. He kept faith with the duke who had entrusted him. He kept faith. That is what the historical record, read carefully, tells us about Herluin de Conteville. He kept faith. And in the long view of history, in the deep, slow movement of dynasties and families and the bonds that hold human societies together, that is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. We end tonight in that Norman valley beside the stream. The church of Grestain is gone, demolished in the revolutions of the 18th century, its stones scattered or absorbed into the fabric of the building that replaced it. The monks are gone. The prayers that once rose from those walls have long since faded into the silence of history. Even the graves are, in practical terms, inaccessible now. their exact locations within the ruined precinct uncertain, their stones vanished. But the stream is still there. The Carbec flows, as it has always flowed, through the wooded valley, past the place where the abbey stood, past the remnants of wall and gateway that survived the centuries of demolition and neglect. The water catches the light of whatever season finds it, and it moves, as it has moved for 1,000 years, through the green hills of Upper Normandy. Herluin saw that stream for the first time, the legend tells us, in a vision. He was sick and suffering and perhaps despairing, and in his need he saw the Virgin Mary, and she told him where healing could be found. He went to the stream. He was healed. He built an abbey in gratitude. Whether the miracle was literal or metaphorical, whether the vision was a genuine supernatural experience or the product of a fevered mind that found in the natural beauty of a Norman valley something that felt divine, we cannot say. What we can say is that something happened at that stream, in that valley, that turned Herluin toward an act of creation. He took what he had, modest lands, moderate income, a faithful nature, and the love of a remarkable woman, and he made something lasting from it. The abbey lasted 7 centuries. The tapestry that his son commissioned has lasted 9. The transformation of England that his family helped to bring about has lasted, in its consequences, to this very day. Not bad, for a man of moderate income and some land south of the Seine. Tonight, we have followed the life of Herluin de Conteville, from its obscure beginning in the early years of an 11th century Norman world, through the extraordinary circumstances of his marriage to Herleva of Falaise, through the perilous years of William's childhood, through the founding of the abbey and the raising of the sons who would change England, and finally to the quiet grave in the valley of Vilaine, where he and his family were laid to rest. He was not a famous man. He is not, and never will be, in the front rank of historical memory. But he was real. He mattered. He kept faith. And for tonight at least, we have remembered him. Sleep well, and we will see you at Sleepy Crown Reborn.